So, thanks for joining us. This is the penultimate webinar for the year of our Oregon Beaches Forever webinar series. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Steve Dundas tonight, but first I will tell you a little bit about Surfrider and about the Oregon Beaches Forever campaign. So, my name is Kaya Hazard. I'm Surfrider's Oregon Regional Manager. Surfrider is a nonprofit organization, and our chapters in Oregon work to protect our ocean, waves, and beaches through grassroots organizing and advocacy. So we work on issues like plastic pollution, water quality, beach access, and making our coastlines and coastal communities more resilient. So to that end, Surfrider has teamed up with Oregon Shores to launch our Oregon Beaches Forever campaign. Through this campaign, we're taking a holistic approach to protecting our beaches. We not only oppose harmful shoreline armoring along our coast on individual and beach-wide scales, as is the case with Beverly Beach, but we're also working on implementation of nature-based erosion solution model projects and policies that promote beach preservation and climate adaptation so that we can move away from hardened shorelines. We're also advocating for local level climate adaptation and improved shoreline management at the city and county level. For example, we worked with Clatsop County to update their comprehensive plan, which was adopted last month and has some really great language in there protecting our public beaches. And last but not least, we will be working with state agencies in the coming year on their rulemaking processes to update and improve existing regulations for shoreline armoring, permitting, and access to and along the shoreline. So, if you would like to learn more about this campaign and stay up to date with upcoming educational events like this one, you can find more information on both the Surfrider and Oregon Shores websites at the link, which I will drop into the chat shortly. I just want to plug, we have one more webinar to finish out the year. So on December 1st, which is a Monday, we will be welcoming Rhiannon Bezor to talk about the Oregon King Tides project. And then we also have two in-person events coming up. On November 13th, we'll be in Newport talking about ODOT's plans to armor Beverly Beach. And then on December 6th, which is a Saturday, we'll be doing a King Tide watch party or tide crawl in Cannon Beach. I'll drop links to all of those in the chat, but now I will turn it over to Mandy with Oregon Shores.
Thanks so much, Kaya. Hi, all. My name is Mandy Watson. I'm the Coastal Conservation Manager with Oregon Shores. For anyone who hasn't heard of us, Oregon Shores is a nonprofit, and we focus on ocean and coastal issues all up and down the coast here in Oregon. And our vision is a healthy and resilient Oregon coast where nature and people thrive together. And we do this by educating and empowering people to protect our coastal ecosystems as well as our coastal communities. We do this through kind of two main avenues. We have our policy advocacy team, as well as conduct education and outreach. We have a wonderful youth education program. Shout out to Rachel. I see you here on this call. We're also well known for our Coast Watch program, where people adopt a mile of our coast to monitor and steward and contribute to a statewide citizen science project. I'm part of the policy advocacy team. Our policy advocacy spans from influencing land use and shoreline planning decisions with our Oregon Beaches Forever team with Kaya and Surfrider, to lobbying for coastal habitat protections at the state legislature, to preventing bad development on Oregon's estuaries, beaches, and dunes. And for more information, you can check out our website. And tonight we're super, super lucky to have Steve Dundas with us. Steve is an environmental and natural resource economist and an associate professor in the Department of Applied Economics at the Coastal Oregon Marine Experiment Station at OSU. His research broadly addresses economic questions in marine and coastal environments with a focus on non-market valuation of ecosystem services, understanding climate adaptation decisions, and evaluation of federal and local policies related to shorelines, such as armoring restrictions, beach nourishment, and managed retreat. His research program addresses complex issues that are interdisciplinary in nature, and this work is supported by the National Science Foundation, NOAA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Forest Service, and Steve is also an associate editor at the Journal of Marine Resource Economics and serves on the science panel for the Puget Sound Partnership. He holds a PhD in economics from North Carolina State University, an MS in agriculture and research economics, and a BS in natural resource management, degrees both from the University of Delaware. So with that, I will let Steve take it away.
All right, thank you, Mandy, and thank you, Kaya, and thanks everybody for joining tonight, and thank you for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to talk. I've been in Oregon about, let's say, 10 years now. 2015 is when I got to Oregon, and immediately became kind of fascinated with the different coastal policies happening in the state. And I think I'd been here 3 months before I was already on stage at the Oregon Coast Economic Forum talking about Goal 18 and coastal armoring, given my prior experience with beach nourishment on the East Coast. But so broadly, I've studied how we interact with our coastlines, how we live, how we get value from coastlines, and how we need to be thinking about adapting our coastlines to a changing future. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about my work that has been focused in Oregon, a high-level summary of probably 10 years worth of different attempts to put economic value on the ecosystem services that are provided by our coasts and beaches here in the Pacific Northwest, and a little insight into what we're trying to do with all that information, combining it with research from other fields to try to improve how we think about managing the 363 miles of coastline in Oregon. I don't really need to do this. Mandy gave a great introduction here. So I'm an associate professor at Oregon State. I'm an environmental economist. Basically, my research interests are what I'll talk to you a lot about tonight is non-market valuation, trying to think about how to take ecosystem services and bring them into a policy discussion in an apples to apples way that policymakers can evaluate them in a similar metric to how much a policy costs, right? So understanding what the benefits, trying to approximate what the benefits to society are of that our ecosystems provide to us. Mandy also mentioned, the research that I'll be talking about tonight majority of it was funded through NOAA, the National Center for Coastal Ocean Science, and then has been, further supported by a couple National Science Foundation grants. I started my journey as an academic late. I started my master's degree when I was 29 years old, my PhD at 31, with the goal of not sitting in an ivory tower and actually having the stuff that I work on matter for policy. So I do take on a number of advisory roles, including the Puget Sound Partnership, the California Ocean Science Trust, and the Nature Conservancy. So I do spend a lot of time talking to folks trying to make change happen on the ground and trying to communicate the academic work that I do to actual on the ground policy changes. So tonight I'm here to talk to you about thinking about coastal and kind of marine ecosystem services. So I think everybody here on this call probably values the Oregon coast, understands that the beaches, the dunes, the ocean provide, improve your well-being and provide a large number of services to society. These ecosystem services influence our well-being directly and indirectly through clean air, clean water, and then through use values that we apply to recreation where we live and how we use those beaches. And the provision of those services can be diminished by things like pollution, habitat destruction, loss of biodiversity, and in a lot of cases, sea level rise, climate change could be disrupting how those flow of services end up benefiting our coastal communities and our society at large. So economic valuation type of work that I do seeks to kind of quantify those ecosystem service benefits and express them in comparable units and typically in monetary terms so they can be compared to other sources of value present in our society. I will say that it is interesting to talk to, say, ecologists and biologists who think, quantifying and monetizing nature is a fool's errand. And my response there, and what I like to maybe express to people on a public facing lecture like this is, it's really about connecting the preferences of society to the metrics that drive decision making. It's not really about finding the exact dollar amount. If any economist tells you, hey, every returning Oregon Coast coho salmon is worth $12.37, they're crazy. It's more about finding an approximate value, understanding preferences for the broader society rather than just the preferences of those in charge and making decisions. And you know, I don't have a ton of time tonight, but the kind of the brief history of that is, a regulatory review process in the United States. It started with an executive order from President Reagan in 1981 that we needed to do benefit cost analysis to review regulatory policies. And at the time, it was really difficult to measure benefits of environmental policies like the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, and the Clean Water Act. So economists got their act together and said, okay, challenge accepted. We're going to try to figure out ways that we can express society's preferences for these things in the metrics that are needed within kind of the US regulatory framework. So that's what a lot of the work I'll be talking about tonight is thinking about economic valuation. How do we learn from people's behavior, and how do we try to place that into a metric that is useful for policy decisions? I will say, if you have questions, please pop them into the chat. I'll be happy to. I have 3 screens going so I can see everything well. If there's a question about clarifying question, I'm happy to stop and answer that as I'm going here. All right, so people hold many values for different types for environmental quality, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by use, non-use, and option values in a minute. But the idea is that they all have some economic importance, some societal importance. And those values can get altered by kind of behavioral feedbacks, different policy changes in hazard risk, and anytime a flow of services changes, it could have a direct impact on human well-being. Another reason why you might want to think about taking an economic lens to this problem is that conservation managers are often faced with limited budgets and making decisions about how do I invest my limited budget to make the best return for that investment in terms of improving environmental quality. They often ask questions like, how much do we invest? Where do we invest? How much do we do now? How much do we do in the future? And in order to improve that decision-making process, it's really helpful to have some kind of rigorous estimate of the benefits of those kind of conservation actions. So that's kind of my pitch for why an economic lens to Oregon's beaches is important, and kind of an introduction to what we're going to be talking about this evening. So as I mentioned, my main research thrust is non-market valuation. The idea here is that the benefits to society from a change in environmental quality, we can measure that as approximating what people will be willing to pay for that change. And we can estimate willingness to pay in a variety of different ways, through behavior, through surveys, and I've done a little bit of all of it on the Oregon coast for different ecosystem services. Usually if we think about what you're willing to pay for something, if there's a market for it, there's usually a price, and you either decide whether you want to pay that price and purchase that good. We're talking about things related to the environment. We don't have those markets. You can't go into the supermarket and buy beach recreation or a quality trip to Hasita Head or something like that. So without markets, we need to do some detective work. We need to either do a deep dive into large data sets, or we need to create surveys to generate our own data to understand how people are making trade-offs with their time, with their budgets, and how they're being affected by changes in the environment. So what non-market valuation is, it's a collection of techniques. Again, probably no one was really thinking about this stuff until that executive order in 1981. But since then, there's been the last 45 years or so, there's been a concerted effort by economists who are focused on environmental issues to develop ways to estimate and monetize benefits and costs associated with environmental quality changes. I mentioned these sources of economic value. Just want to give you a couple examples of what we'll be talking about here tonight. All these things, all 3 of these categories are economically important to our well-being. Some of them are easier to measure than others, and they're use values, option values, and non-use values. So use values are the most intuitive and most straightforward. This is the utility. Utility is an economic term for well-being. Our utility of consuming a good or a service directly is a use value. So for environmental examples like this, kayaking, fishing, bird watching, taking a walk on the beach. I will note I am based in Corvallis, but I do spend a lot of time on the coast, and I would say about 80% of the photos you see in my presentation are ones that I've actually taken myself. So I am out there a lot. I definitely derive a lot of value from visiting the Oregon coast. But use values are typically easy to understand, and then we can kind of use data on people's choices about how they use the environment to kind of infer economic values. Option values are a little trickier, but they're fairly intuitive. It's if someone isn't currently using a resource, but they would like to in the future, they may have some willingness to pay to make sure that resource still exists in the future. So an Oregon example here, so someone from Florida may want to visit Cape Perpetua in the future. So they would be willing to pay some amount. It's probably small, but if you aggregate up all those type of values around the world, it might get pretty large. So that Cape Perpetua would be preserved as it is now for the foreseeable future, so they would have the option to visit in the future. Potentially some of the largest class of values and the most difficult to measure is this concept of non-use value. People assign values to environmental goods and services, even if they don't currently use it and they never will use it. And these are typically form existence values that people might derive benefits from knowing a species continues to exist or an old growth forest continues to exist, even if they don't actually go fishing or go for a walk in that forest. They just want that type of environmental resource to continue to exist. There's also bequest values that you may want to preserve that species or that ecosystem for future use for future generations. In both cases, this is a hard to measure value, but it's not an insignificant because people derive well-being from it. It has economic value. It's just potentially more difficult to measure. All right, so now we switch to Oregon here. So we have, why we're here today. We have hundreds of miles of coastline. About 2/3 of it is sandy beaches, and as we all probably know, it's accessible to the public since 1967. So it's a really important management decision to balance both infrastructure and housing versus ecosystem health, recreation, and there's a lot of different trade-offs that come with how we might think about managing our coastline. In some places, we have these pristine beaches, these beautiful natural ecosystems, and in other places, we have our communities that are positioned in ways to enjoy the natural amenities of our system, but also provide challenges with how we manage those beaches, given sea level rise and other changing environmental conditions. So tonight, the ecosystem services from Beaches and Dune that I'll talk about that we've had a number of research projects, a number of different styles of research trying to estimate just from the beaches and dunes along the Oregon coast, some level of coastal protection, recreation values, habitat for endangered species, and one that's less about tonight, but also part of the interdisciplinary project that we've been working on for the last 8-9 years is thinking about carbon storage in our dune systems. So when I say ecosystem services from beaches and dune, these are the 4 that we've been looking at in our research. All right, so the first set of kind of studies that I'd like to just briefly summarize here are use values that are revealed to the analysts through housing markets and recreation behavior. Housing markets are a really powerful tool that help researchers understand values for environmental quality because it's such an important decision. And houses can be viewed as a bundle of goods that expresses people's preferences and is reflected in the price that they pay. However, the challenge there is that those values are then only associated with the people that live in that particular area, whereas recreation on the Oregon coast is more broad. So we took a two-prong approach to this. Up on your screen now is a quote from an economist from about 75 years ago, 70 years ago or so, that first kind of came up with this idea that where people locate in space and how they behave reveals a lot about the local environment and the local public goods that exist where people choose to locate and how much they are willing to pay for housing. So the quote here that I like is that spatial mobility is the local public goods counterpart to the private market shopping trip. So this is where the detective work comes in. We don't actually observe kind of this, private shopping trip to a grocery store, but we can observe a lot of data about where people choose to locate and the characteristics of the area of the house that they purchase, and we can tease out preferences for different environmental goods and services using statistical techniques and kind of natural experiments in our research design. So we use something called the hedonic pricing method. The theory here is that houses are a bundle of goods or a differentiated product, and that there has to be some kind of compensating differential. The idea that prices have to be paid to compensate for the differences in the characteristics of the good. So as long as we can observe those characteristics, then we observe lots of different sales, we can pop them into a statistical model and tease out each component of the bundled good and understand how it contributed to the overall price that is paid for it. So in the picture here, looking up at Nye Beach and Newport, those homes, I'm sure everyone's heard the expression, the $1 million view, right? So they have a great view of the Pacific Ocean. That view is capitalized into that housing price, and it probably reflects a substantial portion of that value. This type of method is one that can tease out those components of value that are embedded in market transactions for real estate. So the first ecosystem service that we looked at, the first one that I got involved in when I first arrived in Oregon, was thinking about this idea of coastal protection, which led me to our state planning goals and goal 18. And this was the topic that it seemed when I talked to state agencies, groups like Surfrider and other places when I first got here, people were really concerned about coastal armoring. So it seemed like a good place for me to kind of investigate and use the skills that I have to kind of tease out some information from housing markets. So state planning goal 18, for anyone not familiar, basically says it's an armoring prohibition. Any property built after the planning goals are put into place in 1977, you can armor. However, they did allow existing structures to continue to maintain that right to armor because they were afraid to not take away that right in an uncompensated way. So any home that existed before the planning goals went into place still to this day maintains that right to alter their shoreline. So we leveraged data that was collected by state parks, DLCD, and others to characterize every property along the Oregon coast based on their eligibility for Goal 18, and looked at about 15, 20 years of property records. And our results suggested that, homes, are on average, we found zero effect of Goal 18 eligibility. However, the average home in our sample was 30 feet above sea level and on a beach that was actually gaining in width over time. That was on average from, say, 2005 till 2018 across our sample. When we looked at homes that were on vulnerable positions at lower elevations and on eroding beaches, we did find a significant premium for homes that had the right to armor versus those that did not. And these were non-trivial. So what this result is saying is that a similar home, a vulnerable home on an eroding beach, low elevation, would sell for 22% more than a similar home that didn't have the right to armor. So we did find pretty significant premium for eligibility, but interestingly enough, if it was for eligibility alone, the actual presence of riprap actually lowered housing values, suggesting people really don't want riprap out in front of their house, but they would value the option to be able to protect their asset if it became under threat from the ocean. And that's not the end of the story, though. We also looked at how these private decisions are affecting others on the coast. And in a lot of places, this eligibility is not uniform. And so we actually found that homes that were choosing to armor were actually lowering the property values of those nearby homes that were ineligible for armoring. So people might be making these private decisions in their best interest, but they're causing these potential external costs onto others. In economics, that we call that a market failure, and it suggests government intervention is needed to kind of fix the problem, because one person's decisions shouldn't cause another neighbor's home to decrease in value. So that was my first study on the Oregon coast, was looking at this goal 18 issue. And then I had a PhD student kind of pick up and say, well, why do people armor? What is it, what drives that decision? Is it just risk characteristics? Is it just how the erosion rates on the beaches? What is it, an El Nino season? Those things did matter, but interestingly enough, what we did find is that people learn from what they observe around them. We actually found the biggest single determining factor of what made eligible properties decide to armor was collective armoring in their neighborhood, so that there was more of a peer effect, learning effect, rather than a risk effect here. Yeah, I see in the chat, yeah, that the piecemeal approach to armoring, it creates a lot of challenges, and then I think these results kind of speak to that. And I've actually sat on some focus groups trying to figure out how to fix some of these issues with Goal 18 and how it's applied across the landscape. But the spatial piecemeal approach definitely generates a lot of these potential negative feedbacks onto others. What was interesting here is that this particular paper demonstrated how important the prohibition on armoring is for keeping armoring off of Oregon's coast. So we were able to run, our model here was we observed when every home since 1977 had decided to armor. So we had this long time series of data, both on beach conditions, wave conditions, El Nino conditions, and the specific location and timing of when the armoring had existed. That enabled us to do some kind of future simulations about how that armoring pattern may change over time. And our first pass was looking at sea level rise, and yes, that had some effect, but really what mattered is goal 18. If we remove goal 18, we would see armoring increase nearly 70% over the next 25 years. And this picture kind of gives you that idea. The blue line is kind of our simulated future path based on our model projections. The bumps around year 16 and year 35 are when we applied like a bad El Nino year to the data. The red line is when we add sea level rise. So that's the climate variability component. The black line is the trajectory if we pulled goal 18. So it really highlights how important goal 18 is to minimizing the amount of hardening of our coastline in Oregon. So I initially got involved with thinking about beach management in Oregon through goal 18 and armoring, and then quickly started to expand afterwards. A recent PhD student took a lot of data from geomorphology colleagues and coastal engineers, using LiDAR data, all kinds of different satellite data, and put together a model with probably the richest set of measurements along the Oregon coast that I've seen. And this just schematic on the screen shows you all the type of measurements that we have all on the coast at 50-meter transects, and applied them to not only the oceanfront, but also like all the homes in coastal communities. And we did find on average, each meter of beach width per house is worth about $300. People, but that I'll show you in a minute, that varies depending on how close you are to the beach or not. We did find for a meter of dune height was highly valuable. Our sense is that high dunes provide a sense of protection to the community, not just for the oceanfront homes. That value did not dissipate. Every home within 2 kilometers of the coastline seemed to value extra dune height in their community. Interestingly enough, the dune width, we actually found negative effects on housing. And our hypothesis there is that the wider the dune is, the harder it is to access, or the longer people have to walk to access the beach. So that might be some, a function of recreation or access that is emerging there. We do find, the value of beach width declines pretty rapidly as the home is further away from the shoreline. It's very valuable. Beach width is very valuable to those oceanfront homes. Probably some combination of coastal protection, view shed aesthetic. We can't tease that out with these models because we don't actually talk to these homeowners. We just observe a lot of data about their decisions. That value drops to about $500 for a meter of beach width, about 250 meters from the shoreline. And once you get about half a kilometer away from the beach, we don't see any effect of beach width on property values. But that does give us a sense to the wider market of how the characteristics of the beaches are translating to a housing market, and can reveal how much value they are, how much beaches are improving property values. All right, in the same space of use values, we did do a survey on recreation. Going back even further, about I have a couple. First quote was from 56. This is from 49. In 1949, Congress asked the National Park Service to say, "Hey, we need to know how valuable the national parks are." And the initial response was, "Well, there's so many different values that we possibly can't evaluate these things in monetary terms." And what happened was a statistician named Harold Hotelling said, well, wait a minute, if we think about the decision of someone to recreate, they are giving up something else that they could be doing, whether it's work, other things that they could be doing, and they are taking time to access a particular site for recreation. So he proposed, why don't we take the idea of the round trip travel cost that someone incurs to get to a recreation destination, driving costs, time cost, entry fees, all those things, and have that proxy for how much they are willing to pay for accessing that recreation experience. And so he proposed a trip demand function that was a function of how much people were spending on travel costs to get to this location, and also quality that you could observe about that particular site. So that if that quality changed, we could then infer from that demand function how people value improvements or how much damage, decline in environmental quality cost. So this was the kind of the fundamental idea that drove this idea that we could actually do some detective work here and approximate an economic value people place on recreation by looking at the choices they make and across the options that they have for using their time. And people often ask, well, why is recreation so important? Well, a lot of the value of recreation stems from the quality of the environment that's there. So it's a great avenue to try to tease out the value for environmental quality that people have. Also, if Congress says, yeah, we need to do a benefit cost analysis to see how viable the Clean Water Act is, well, it usually passes with flying colors, with massively more benefits than cost. And a lot of those benefits arrive from the fact that, compared to 1972, our waters are more swimmable, fishable, and causing less health problems. And also because as societies grow wealthier, they tend to recreate more. That's kind of the economic justification for thinking about it that way. Unfortunately, we did do a survey, um, Oregon-wide a couple years ago. Unfortunately, the full analysis of the recreation data for people traveling to all the developed beaches in Oregon is still in progress. However, I can report, last year, a intrepid young undergrad really wanted to do, she was from Lincoln City. She took one of my classes. She's like, I want to do a travel costs analysis to value beach recreation in Lincoln City. And I said, well, you're in luck. I actually have the data that will enable you to do that. And she was able to do an undergrad research project and estimated that the value of a day at the beach in Lincoln City was about $24. And this is estimated through survey data where we asked people like how often, where they went, and how they use Oregon beaches. What was interesting, I asked her to we did the survey looking back a year and asked them about their trips in different seasons. Surprising to me, the trips in the spring were the most valuable, and there was significant variation depending on what time of year these trips happened, that the value they had to the individual. Intuitively, what that means, if you look at that spring and summer, that means in spring and summer, there's probably a lot of people traveling for spring break, summer vacation, other things to Lincoln City, whereas in the fall and winter, we observe a lot more localized recreation with low travel costs. So even though when you think about aggregating something like this up, a spring trip might be worth a little bit more, but we might observe a lot more fall and winter trip from locals who have a kind of a low travel cost. These numbers do reflect some validity with studies in other locations. A recent study in San Diego suggests the value of a beach day in San Diego County was about $27. So at least the initial result from the undergrad research is consistent with findings from California. But I do anticipate being able to say something broader about, a much wider stretch of beaches along the Oregon coast, hopefully within the next year. All right. So we're about 40 minutes in, 20 minutes left. Is there any burning questions people have for me? Take a pause for a moment here, or I can just continue and we can wait until I'm done. All right, I don't see anything in the chat, so I'll just keep going. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about is the idea of non-use values. So there's nothing as an economist we can say about non-use values from housing markets or recreation behavior, because those are all based on somebody buying and living in a home and using the environment around them or recreating in the space. So those are all use values. Any non-use values, we would have to go to what we call stated preferences, or basically surveys where we set up hypothetical markets or hypothetical valuation questions, and then infer values based on people's choices in those situations. This is a quote from an economics journal that really highlights the magnitude, potential magnitude of non-use values and the challenges associated with like missing those things when we think about important policy. So I still teach my students about Exxon Valdez, even though none of them were alive when that happened in the late 80s. But the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska was kind of a lynch point for this type of methodology. Like the U.S. government was like, well, this is a big deal. This is a pristine waterway. Its effects are obviously more acute in Alaska, but this affects our natural resource damage assessment law. Said, hey, this affects every American. A stated preference study on the damages to the nation as a whole basically said there was a $5 billion loss to the country. In contrast, a recreation study similar to the one where we asked people where their trips were going, specific to that area of Alaska, suggested the damages were 3.8 million. So that's a 1,000-fold difference. That 3.8 million was very specific use values for recreation in the place that was most affected. the $5 billion estimate was the kind of impact that suggests people in the United States would be willing to pay to not see something like that happen again, to preserve that pristine environment, even if they never actually plan to go to Alaska or see the Prince Edward Island Sound. So there's a lot of potential economic value in natural ecosystems and wild species that is typically hard to measure and is often missed if you don't approach it from a kind of stated preference approach. This is a visual of the question that these researchers went around and asked random households throughout the United States to approximate that $5 billion estimate in damages. They were asking them saying, hey, we can, the way they framed it was, we would like this to never, if you want this to never happen again, like the US government has to fund a program that will ensure safety and make sure something like that doesn't happen again. How much would you be willing to pay? Even though they didn't ask it that way, they randomized the number. If you see that last line there says like, hey, if there's a program that can stop Prince William Sound from getting hit with another large oil spill, would you contribute $60? Would you vote for that program? And so they got thousands of households across the country to answer the survey and aggregated that number up and estimated that combination of both use and non-use values. Another example of what these surveys look like is from one that I did about preservation of Oregon coast coho. This one's a little bit more complicated. It's called the choice experiment, where you're saying, hey, here's the conditions. That status quo column is, hey, this is not going to be costly, but this is how things will look. This species will remain threatened. We could take action, but it's costly to do so. And here are how these different attributes would improve. If these are your choices, which alternative do you choose? So we put people in hypothetical situations where the things that they're choosing over are attributes of environmental quality that they might care about. So when we also sent out a survey asking for people's where they recreated on the Oregon coast, we also asked them a stated preference question. We proposed a hypothetical sediment management program that would prevent the loss of safe recreation hours due to better sand management or sediment management along the coastline. And this arose from conversations with people at Surfrider, people at the state. What metric do people care about that would be good for kind of this hypothetical valuation scenario? And so we did a lot of focus grouping, we did a lot of testing, and this is kind of an example of the valuation question that we asked. We framed it as a ballot initiative, as Oregonians are used to seeing things like this on their November ballots at a statewide level. And it was framed around this idea that, as sea level rise continues, the amount of time available for safe recreation on a beach might be on the decline. If the state was to implement a program that could maintain or prevent a loss of those safe hours, would you be willing to take on additional costs each year? And so, we framed it as a ballot measure question, yes or no. And we randomized the costs that would arise through an additional thing in state income taxes every year. We got 1,800 responses from an online panel and about 1,000 responses from a mailing that we did to 10,000 random households around Oregon, sending them to an online survey. And our high-level results at this point are every Oregon household on average were willing to pay about $5 per year to prevent a 1% loss of safe hours. Now, what does that actually mean in the aggregate? Well, if a program was to prevent a 10% loss of safe hours across all Oregon beaches, it's quite valuable, but we're still refining how we think about the aggregation process, because this is kind of really important, because you'll notice the lower bound is still pretty big at 42 million, but the upper bound is, much, much larger, $400 million per year. Right now, the lower bound is based on this idea that our response rate on the survey was about 10%. We assume only 10% of Oregon households care about our beaches. That would be the estimate. The upper bound is saying if our survey on average reflected the preferences of every Oregon household, then the benefits would be approximately 400 million a year. If I had to guess, once we do our corrections for sample selection bias and all kinds of biases associated with these surveys, my guess is we'll end up with a number somewhere between 200 and 300 million dollars a year that people are willing to pay to maintain safe recreation access to Oregon beaches. We also use surveys to think about habitat and biodiversity along our coastline. Um, so some of you may or may not know a lot of the big dunes that are covered in thick grasses along the Oregon coast. Those grasses are invasive. They're European beach grass, and they're not supposed to be here. But they were brought here in order to stabilize the sands and aid development about 120 years ago. So we actually did a survey a few years ago thinking about dune restoration. And this was motivated by kind of actions of the U.S. Forest Service trying to restore natural dune habitats in the Florence and South area of the Forest Service land along our coastline. It was also motivated by the fact that there's a handful of endangered birds and plants that are on the U.S. endangered species list because of the lack of their natural habitat. So we sent out 4,200 surveys across Oregon and Washington, asking people about different restoration scenarios for dunes, including level of restoration, size, and recreation access. And what we were able to learn there is that quality mattered more than quantity. That if people would be willing to pay anywhere between $6,000 to $23,000 per acre for a fully restored dune habitat, a little bit less for moderate restoration. But it does reflect a pretty big trade-off that we have on our coastline between these big, tall, stable dunes that stabilize our coastline versus the biodiversity and habitat that would thrive if those grasses were removed. All right. So I spent about a half hour talking to you about maybe 5 or 6 different studies where we've specifically tried to understand the preferences of people in Oregon and people in the region for the different flows of ecosystem services that come from Oregon's beaches. So what? What does that all mean? What do we actually do with that? How does that help policymakers? What does that mean for coastal communities? How can we use this information in a way that's productive and useful to thinking about challenges associated with managing our coastline? So currently I'm working with a large team of ecologists and engineers and coastal experts, and most of the valuation work I've talked to you about here was building the pieces up for this larger project we've been trying to put together for the last 10 years. And what we are trying to do is integrate the measurement of these services, not just their economic value, but also how the quantity of those service flows are going to change with a changing climate, and developing a framework to help guide decision making about how we adapt to changes coming from climate change. And so right now we're at a point where we can kind of apply and demonstrate the approach at the county level on the Oregon coast. And we settled on Tillamook County as it was an area that had a variety of different coastal systems, from beaches to bluffs to cliffs, variation in Goal 18 policy measures, and just kind of representative county that was a good place for us to test out this framework and see if we could use it moving forward. So we're combining the work that I've just talked about, these economic values that we've estimated for what people place on beaches. And then we're going to try to characterize them, apply them to the current landscape based on the current quality and condition of our beaches and dunes, and then evolve that landscape with a stochastic climate emulator, which if you have questions about, I can't answer because that's not my field. There's a lot of really smart engineers who've been building this over the years, and we're using their outputs and trying to figure out how beach width and dune conditions are changing as climate might change in the future. And we're then going to use that also where we're bringing in the policy here is we can also see how different existing and maybe aspirational different land use policies could affect those flow of services as well. So we're trying to kind of evolve the coastal landscape and then kind of reassess those service flows, look at what the trade-offs are, and help decision makers understand kind of a current view versus a 30-year view of what their coastline might look like and how changing beach and dune conditions are going to affect well-being of their communities. This is just a summary of so in economics, to get at welfare changes, we need a price and we need a quantity. The prices are what I've talked about for the last half hour, how we understand the value, the price of those flows. The engineers and the ecologists are working on the quantity side. How big are the dunes? How much carbon is in those dunes? We're also using data from state agencies. How many car counters? How many cars show up at particular recreation sites at a particular time? So we're combining a lot of information about the current landscape and the values that we estimated. To operationalize this, we've basically broken up the coastline into decision units. So we are thinking about, is this beach a dune back beach? Is it a bluff back beach? Is it publicly owned? Is it privately owned? And what is the current policy landscape? Are they Goal 18 eligible, ineligible? Those were kind of the main driver factors that we to operationalize something like this, we wouldn't. It would be intractable from a computational sense to have every parcel of land making their own decision. And it also is not something you want for a policy. You don't want the tyranny of a million small decisions. Like land use policy should be done on a broader scale. So we were trying to group large chunks of land based on their characteristics as a decision unit. Then on the policy side, we're like, well, what could happen on these decision units? On public land, we could think about habitat restoration areas. Those are ongoing in some places to help endangered species. On private land, we have our current existing armoring structure. There's also dune management plans cropping up in lots of different communities along the coastline. We could think about sediment management, also known as beach nourishment, even though that tends to be prohibitively expensive, given the dynamics of our coastline. We could also think about managed retreat, which is hasn't really been on the table in Oregon, but there are programs in New Jersey, New York, Louisiana, Texas, and at the federal level with FEMA, trying to move people out of high hazard areas as a way to kind of mitigate hazard risk. And this picture here just kind of illustrates the range of solutions. You could think about a hardened engineering infrastructure like riprap. The picture in the upper left there, natural infrastructure, that's near where I grew up in New Jersey. That's what they do in New Jersey. They just dredge a whole bunch of sand from offshore to kind of reinforce natural infrastructure. And then you could also think about restoration or ecosystem health, investing capital in that direction to improve ecosystem service flows. So we tried to take policies from each of these buckets when thinking about potential future coast-wide land use policies that decision makers might want to know how kind of a future simulation might turn out. So the fourth step is we're going to apply our ecosystem service values in the current landscape. We're going to use parcel boundaries, decision units, land use types, and all of our estimated non-market values to try to characterize what the aggregate value of those service flows are currently, and so that we can see how they might change under future scenarios. And so this gives you an idea of how big these decision units are. For those not quite familiar, that stretch in the middle there is Bob Straub on the bottom up to Cape Kiwanda and Pacific City. And we've been able to actually run through a few of these test scenarios, and I'll give you kind of a preview of the results. So one of our decision units is public land. It's dune backed. It's actually a state park. So we could continue on its current management path, or we could take part of it and turn it into a habitat restoration area for western snowy plovers and pink sand verbena and other endangered birds and plants. And that would be plausible because it's a state-owned piece of public land. The trade-offs that we'd have to consider in this situation is, well, currently, in its current state, those dunes are actually storing a non-trivial amount of carbon that has some economic value to leave that carbon there so it doesn't release to the atmosphere and contribute to climate change. We have some recreation access opportunities. It is a state park. And then there's also some biodiversity or habitat values associated with it. Now, these numbers are, like I said, any numbers that you see, don't take them as gospel or exact. They're approximations based on a whole lot of different work that has a lot of uncertainty around it, but these are approximations for this exercise. So this one 500-hectare piece of land, this is Bob Straub State Park. We can calculate how big the dunes are. We can translate the value of the stored carbon using US government estimates of the social cost of carbon or marginal, which is like the damage caused by one additional ton of greenhouse gases. We approximate the recreation value based on visitor use days and estimates of the value of a day trip to the beach. And our weak spot here is our initial starting value of our habitat. But you add up those different service flows that come from this piece of land to Oregonians. And we calculated it's about, just the value of those services is about 12 million per year. If we use the stochastic climate emulator to move that piece of land forward 25 years, we actually see increased carbon storage. That's partly a function of increased dune size and also the projections of increased damages from climate change. However, that parcel of land is going to erode, so our recreation value declines because there's less time available for recreation. But overall, the total value doesn't change that much, but we lose some value. Another potential option would be to make it a habitat restoration area. We would see carbon values decline because you'd be pulling out vegetation that stores carbon, but you would see a large bump in habitat biodiversity value because we learned from the survey that people will be willing to pay for high quality restored natural dune habitat along the Oregon coast. So the green box there shows you there's not a ton of levers to make some big changes in the flow of services, but different options could move different service flows in either direction. The last example I'll give before I stop here is Neskowin, part of Neskowin, private land. It's dune backed, but there's not much dune left, and it's pretty much already fully armored. So the policies we could look at is, hey, we could do nothing, just keep it armored, or we could try some kind of sediment management to counteract erosion. The trade-offs to consider here: erosion reduces beach width, which will reduce protection and recreation. Sediment management is really costly, so it's often not really considered in Oregon because of the challenges with producing the amount of sediment needed to manage the beaches. The beauty of this is that we can actually approximate the values associated with a hypothetical program and see if that would outweigh any potential costs of trying something like this out. So in this case, you can see there's different service flows because it's a different type of system. Beach width is providing protection values. The minimal dunes are still providing some protection values. Armoring has some protection values. There's minimal carbon values. There's a recreation value, and there's not much habitat there. So we kind of ignore that in this scenario. If we do nothing, beach width is going to decline. We actually see recreation value turn negative. How we get that transformation is that we know from the survey that people are willing to pay for anything that would prevent the loss of safe recreation hours. So we can actually see the recreation of the value of a beach actually turn negative because there's a pent up willingness to pay to stop that from happening. And then we could say, hey, what if there's a sediment management program that tries to take the edge off on the beach width loss, and we can, in this particular scenario, we see this maybe the sediment management program maintains some value protection values from beach width, but the real mover is, that result that we're finding that people are willing to pay a lot to keep developed beaches in Oregon accessible for safe recreation. What this means is that if you look at the differences in the green boxes between those two future scenarios, that suggests that as long as that 25-year sediment management plan doesn't cost more than $55 million, then it might be worth it to try it out. So that's the type of insights we hope to be able to play around with these future scenarios and these values. So where do we go from here? We're trying to figure out a way. I'm trying to figure out a way to kind of optimize this coast-wide rather than just doing test cases, seeing if we can do it across the entire coastline. But basically, for policymakers, we want to be able to assess these key trade-offs, and it says here, develop efficiency frontiers. And what that means is something like this. Like right there, if we go back to the Bob Straub State Park example, that red dot, so the y-axis is the value of biodiversity, the x-axis is the value of carbon storage. The red dot is kind of where we are currently. Those black dots are potential future scenarios that we could get to. We could go all in on carbon storage and forget biodiversity, or we could think about moving up towards kind of those green arrows where we improve some habitat, we lose the carbon storage value, but we gain value to society through providing habitat for endangered species. So, but that's a key trade-off in like the public space for thinking about future management. And I appreciate your time and attention tonight. And I was only 3 minutes over, which is surprising, but I will be here for the next 30 minutes or so to address any comments and questions that you might have.
Steve, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot. I'm a fan of your work, and I have so many questions for you. But I see that we have one in the chat from Ted and one in the QA. I'm also happy to unmute anyone if they want to ask their question directly instead of me reading it out loud. I guess we'll start with Ted's question. Given that individuals or sometimes communities use nature in different ways and therefore may value ecological attributes very differently from one another, how do you use to take those differences into consideration when advising policymakers about the values of ecosystem services?
Well, thanks, Ted, for the very hard question. It's a great question, and it's a constant space for disagreement among economists who do this. A lot of times we try to gloss over different ecological attributes and focus on like kind of the end use, knowing that there's a lot of different ecological attributes that might contribute to the quality of that end use. But I think that probably the most accepted answer is that the general public is better at understanding those kind of composite end uses rather than the pieces that contribute to that quality. So valuation is hard enough as it is, because a lot of times you might be asked, we struggled with that the dune quality survey, because we actually had to hire an illustrator because there was no pictures of natural dune habitat in color left in Oregon. We had to do about 8 different focus groups to get those questions to the point where we were confident that people that saw the survey would understand what trade-offs we were asking them to evaluate. So that survey is actually a great example, because our initial survey was about western snowy plovers and pink sand verbenas and species, direct specific things that would benefit from dune restoration. And we had to actually pull back and focus on high, medium, or low quality restoration, because that was the end product that people understood, whereas all the different ecological pieces that went into it kind of were going over people's heads. And we would not be confident in people sharing their preferences over things that they didn't quite understand. That wouldn't give us much usable information for a policymaker. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, I have tried in my career to try to go after some specific ecological attributes, but I have found that it's difficult to get the general population to understand and kind of truthfully reveal preferences over something that they might not quite understand how it works.
Great. Thanks, Ted, for that question. And Steve, thanks for that answer. Um, Charlie, I'm going to read your question because you asked it earlier, but let me know if you want to come off of mute to explain. But Charlie asked, how do we measure economic uses related to beaches that are dynamic and move around? The currency of our beaches really comes down to the sand, the amount of it, and more importantly, where it is. Some days, for example, surfing along open beaches are as dynamic as the beaches themselves. Surfers move where the sandbars move. Other uses based on a more static, place-based use, housing market, state park, access, etc.
That's another great question. Our our ability to credibly value things does depend on it's a direct function of how good our information is. Um, so I'll give you an example that will kind of address your question, but so historically, when people have been economists have been doing research on the value of beach width for probably 30 years. Accurate measurements of beach width to apply to, say, housing markets or recreation decisions are they're often measured at one point in time at varying levels of tide, different times of the season, but because it's historically been hard to measure, like that one measurement, say in May of 2016, will be applied to decisions from 2010 to 2020. So we have like in terms of trying to tease out these dynamics, we typically have a data problem, a measurement problem. One of the papers that I talked about today, we're trying to see how much that measurement matters, at least in the housing market. So we do have from a geomorphologist here at OSU, Peter Ruggiero, and his lab, we have a model, a stochastic climate emulator that can measure hourly water levels at 50-meter transects. So we can take that information and create this simulated panel of beach width, and the variation in that, especially in Oregon, is huge, as you can imagine. And we're currently trying to unpack how. So for example, in a housing market analysis, we would historically take the one measurement of beach width we had and stick it in the model and see what happens. Now we have a million measurements of beach width. Which one do we stick in the model? Which one are people keying in on to make those decisions? Is it an average? Is it is it at high tide? Is it at low tide? Is it in January? Is it in June? And we're not really sure exactly how to proceed at this point to take kind of those dynamic movements into account in these type of models. I think it's possible, and we have a data set now. I just haven't figured out a way to. I have run, like a machine learning algorithm that used all kinds of transformations, but the output was not intuitive, and I'm not quite sure how to use it. But so we're starting to think about that because we actually have potentially credible measurements of that dynamic flow of sand, and we can potentially use that to update how we think about estimating these values, both in housing and a recreation context. But yeah, it's definitely a big challenge. It's typically about data, and it seems like we're maybe on the edge of being able to say something about that.
Great, thanks. Lori is seeking some clarification. They say you gave an example of private land in Nesquin. All beaches in Oregon are public, so I'm wondering where in Nesquin private beaches are located, unless I misunderstood.
Yes, I apologize there. So all beaches are public. What we used to determine those decision units was the first set of properties off of the beach, right? Is it a state park or their houses, essentially? So it was more about what's next to the beach than what all the beaches are public. but the what's next to the beach. And so if it's housing, infrastructure, and it's private property, those policy decisions might differ from if it's public land. That's in addition to the beaches, like a state park. Well, yeah, that's an important clarification. I do see mention of Buxton in the chat. It's like 5 more houses went down last week in North Carolina.
Yeah, that's been pretty exciting to watch.
Very much an unmanaged retreat scenario.
Right. My question for you, Steve, is state parks is now charging fees to access their parks. I was wondering if you knew if what like how they determine their prices. Did they do any like willingness to pay models, or
Mm.
because I feel like it's a very good price. I would be willing to pay a lot more to access a well-managed, clean state park. So I was just wondering if you knew how they came up with their prices.
I don't,
Okay.
but I imagine they're setting prices in direct response to funding management and upkeep of the facilities rather than trying to gouge consumers, of the full willingness to pay, right? It's a good thing that the parks aren't, price discriminators and can charge people what they'd be willing to pay to access them.
Great, thanks.
I get,
Any
I
more questions?
can I have actually just you said something that thought I was following, but apparently I wasn't. How far along is ODOT in thinking that they're going to armor Beverly Beach?
Yeah, that's a great question. We also have an in-person event on that in
Okay.
Newport at Brew Brewing on November 13th. But the last we heard is they're working a little bit with the county on putting together their application, but have not submitted their goal 18 application yet.
Okay. Well, I will make sure I talk to people because I actually did a quick and dirty benefit cost analysis for ODOT about Beverly Beach. And my analysis says they need to reroute it because riprap is a bad idea because of the recreation value of that place. So, and they didn't want to. I went to one meeting and then they kicked me out because they didn't want to hear it anymore. Um, so, if anybody wants to see that report or have me walk them through it, just let me know.
Yeah, we'll be reaching out to you. We would love to see that report.
Okay, it seems like Charlie has read it and knows what it says. Okay, good.
Great. Well, any last questions? Alrighty. Then if that's the case, maybe we should call it a night. Steve, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. And thanks everybody for the questions and your attention. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciated the discourse in the chat tonight. We'll send a follow-up email with some links and events. And yeah, I hope everyone has a really good night and thanks for joining.